by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
By scratching the royal surface, you always get a terrible shock, because behind the flawless, polished discipline protected by centuries of tradition lies a heavy emotional reality that can shatter the crown's perfect mask in a single second. The state banquet was meant to be an absolute masterpiece of royal prestige, where every single detail, from the shining silver to the placement of international dignitaries, followed strict protocol and royal order. But one quiet, calculated movement near the top table changed everything and exposed the deep wounds that the palace has tried to silence for decades. Camilla stepped toward a specific chair near the top table, a place that everyone inside Buckingham Palace knew carried a meaning far deeper than simple seating arrangement or royal rank. This specific chair carried something sharper than protocol, because it carried the living memory of Diana. Camilla did not rush her steps. She moved with the ultimate confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made, and that her new title as Queen Consort gave her the right to claim any space she desired. Dignitaries waited in silence, royal aides watched nervously, and the protocol officers responsible for arranging royal ceremony froze completely with the kind of absolute stillness that says a dangerous mistake is happening in real time. Catherine's reaction was immediate, human, and devastating as she realized what was unfolding right before her eyes. Her hands tightened around her formal gloves, her eyes filled with water, and tears broke through her defense. She was not crying over mere furniture or a minor breach of etiquette. She was crying because that seat represented William's mother, the deep wound his family never truly healed, and the sacred memory the palace honored by leaving certain places untouched. William noticed a shift before his father, King Charles, did. The prince immediately lowered his voice, stepped nearer to his wife, and placed a steadying hand close to her arm, careful not to turn private pain into a public spectacle. But Catherine could not hide the damage that had been done. Her tears had already told the absolute truth to everyone in the room. The future king looked from his wife's tearful face to the empty chair, and something deep inside William hardened into cold anger. Camilla remained near the chair, caught between her own pride and the necessity of retreat, while the Queen Consort felt the heavy silence closing around her like a judgment. King Charles understood the scale of the disaster instantly. The monarch had seen many disputes over precedence and royal ranking before during his long life in the institution. Normally, precedence meant the formal order of importance at royal events, and it could easily be settled with an official document, a quiet whisper, or a swift adjustment by a courtier. But this situation could not be solved by rules. A senior courtier stepped forward to intervene, yet no one in the banquet hall needed an official announcement. The entire room knew that Camilla had reached for a sacred place the family had never released, and Catherine's tears had turned that reach into an immediate reckoning. As Catherine tried to compose her emotions, the room began to understand that the single chair carried the weight of every buried sorrow the palace had tried to bury for years. To outsiders, it might have looked like a simple dispute over palace placement, rank, and ceremony. But inside the palace walls, everyone knew it was far more dangerous than that. Catherine was not simply reacting to a physical chair, and Camilla was not simply choosing a random seat. Diana was not even present in the room, yet her memory dominated the entire state banquet with force that no crown title or royal command could ever erase. Catherine stood near the banquet table with the kind of intense stillness that comes only when a person is fighting a massive emotional battle in front of the public. She gripped her fabric tightly, pressing her fingers together, as if that small act could hold back everything rising inside her heart. The princess had become the true emotional anchor of the new royal generation, the one everyone expected to smile through intense pressure, soften William's burdens, and carry the family legacy forward with absolute grace. But in that exact moment, Grace felt almost cruel, because the chair before her was directly tied to Diana's tragic loss, William's childhood grief, and a pain the palace had polished for the world but never truly healed. Camilla held her posture high, and that pride made the silence even sharper. The Queen Consort had spent decades fighting for public acceptance, standing inside a monarchy that had welcomed her formally, while still measuring her against the shadow of a woman the public never stopped loving. Every step Camilla took toward that chair carried the weight of her own long struggle. If she backed away, she risked looking defeated in front of the court. If she stayed, she risked proving that personal recognition had become far more important than restraint. And so she remained there close enough to the seat for everyone to understand her claim, but unable to escape the heavy judgment forming around her. William saw everything clearly, and the prince did not need anyone to explain why his wife's eyes had filled with tears. He knew the profound meaning of that chair long before a single A could speak. It belonged to memory. It belonged to the mother he had mourned in the eyes of the world and protected in the privacy of his heart. And now his own wife was standing there weeping while his father watched from only a few steps away, trapped between the woman he had married and the son whose silence was hardening into absolute resistance. Charles felt the walls closing in as the king saw Camilla expose Catherine deeply wounded and William becoming colder by the second. He understood that this was not a simple seating mistake that could be corrected with a whispered order. It was a fundamental question of legacy. Could Diana's place be touched? Could her memory be moved aside for convenience? And could the palace ask a grieving son and his tearful wife to accept it in the name of order? The devastating answer was already forming in the heavy silence. The sharpest pain inside that grand banquet hall did not actually begin at the table itself, because one earlier hidden moment had already set this massive royal disaster into motion weeks before the guests arrived. Every dangerous royal rupture has a quiet beginning, but the most destructive ones rarely start in front of the public or under the flash of cameras. This specific conflict began behind closed doors during a private rehearsal dinner, where a single careless remark changed the temperature of the room and fractured the fragile peace within the family. No official cameras captured the moment, and no public record preserved the exchange, but everyone who heard it understood instantly that a dangerous line had been crossed. Camilla raised her glass with practiced calm, and the entire room followed her hand before anyone understood the deep ambition hiding inside that simple social gesture. The private dinner had been carefully arranged as a pre-banquet rehearsal, a quiet palace gathering used by senior staff to settle small details before a major ceremonial evening. It was supposed to be completely controlled, polite, and forgettable for everyone involved. Instead, the queen consort looked across a long table and suggested that the old seating traditions should finally be modified to reflect the position of the present queen. The words she used were soft and casual, but the structural meaning behind them was not. Everyone sitting at that table knew exactly which specific tradition she was referring to, and everyone knew whose sacred memory stood directly in the way of her ambition. Catherine heard the remark before the conversation could move on to other palace matters. The princess slowly set down her glass, and that tiny sharp sound carried more warning than any raised voice could have ever done in a royal room. She understood instantly that Diana's symbolic place inside the palace was being deliberately drawn into a political fight it should have never entered. That specific seat mattered to the family, because it was not about formal protocol alone. Protocol meant the cold rules used by the institution to decide royal order, ceremony, and physical placement. But this empty chair was something far more fragile than rules, because it was about grief, it was about William's heart, and it was about whether a mother lost too soon could still be honored inside a family that had learned to survive by hiding its pain. William did not challenge Camilla openly in front of the staff, but the prince moved immediately after dinner with the quiet focus of a man who felt deeply wounded. He tracked down a senior protocol aide in the corridor and asked one direct, unyielding question about whether Diana's reserved place would remain completely untouched for the state banquet. The aide hesitated for a long second, and that brief hesitation told the prince everything he needed to know. Discussions had already happened behind his back, someone had already tested the boundaries, and someone had already imagined a grand banquet hall, without Diana's lingering shadow over it. For William, that was not a modern adjustment. It was an absolute betrayal of his childhood memory. King Charles tried to soften the emotional impact when the matter finally reached his office. The king told William that no personal insult was intended toward his mother, that Camilla had only spoken from the formal position she now held, and that the royal family could not remain frozen in the past forever. But William heard only avoidance where he desperately needed protection and respect. Charles wanted peace and order within his household, but his son wanted a clear protective line drawn around memory. And between them stood Catherine, quietly telling William later that evening that some sacred memories should never be negotiated for political convenience. The prince did not answer his wife at first, but his heavy silence showed how deeply that warning had cut into his mind. Camilla then took another step by asking a senior household officer to formally review the entire banquet seating plan, and that specific request created a direct path to the public disaster. The household officer understood the immense danger of the request, yet the cold machinery of the palace moved forward anyway. A seating card with prepared a sacred place was reconsidered, and private family tension began turning into an unstoppable public consequence. By the time the final seating card was placed on the banquet table on the night of the event, the palace had already stepped too close to the edge of the cliff. So when Camilla stepped toward that chair on the night of the state banquet, Catherine was not witnessing a simple mistake by the staff. She was watching a private warning become a public reality. The most explosive royal confrontations are rarely loud or chaotic. They happen in lowered voices, fixed eyes, and movements, so controlled they become terrifying to watch. Beside the grand banquet table with the silver shining and foreign dignitaries, waiting Catherine and Camilla face each other across a space no wider than a single chair. Yet that narrow physical space held decades of unresolved family pain. Camilla reached the chair first, and the long pause that followed felt sharper than any official announcement. Her hand rested lightly on the back of the chair, not with physical force, but with enough certainty for everyone standing nearby to understand the unspoken message. The queen consort was not merely waiting to be seated, she was actively testing whether anyone inside that room would dare to challenge her new claim. For many years she had lived inside the difficult space between formal acceptance and deep public resistance. She had been crowned beside Charles, yet she was still measured against Diana's memory every day of her life. Now that survival struggle had reached the formal banquet table, and the silence around her became almost impossible to bear for the court. Catherine stepped forward before the delicate moment could be completely swallowed by palace discipline. The princess was visibly shaken by the move, but her voice stayed low-controlled and deeply wounded as she asked why that particular seat had been changed without warning. The question sounded simple on the surface, yet it carried everything the family had avoided saying aloud for decades. It mattered immensely because the chair was not an ornament of status. It was a living symbol of Diana's place in William's life. It was a physical reminder that grief does not disappear simply because the monarchy moves on to a new reign. It also mattered because Catherine had become the chosen person expected to protect the emotional bridge between the past and the future of the crown. And now that bridge was being tested in front of international guests. Camilla answered with controlled firmness, stating that the banquet order had been officially reviewed by the household and that her position as queen now required full recognition. Banquet order meant the arranged placement of guests by rank, duty, and royal importance. But even that official explanation could not soften the blow to the family. Catherine's tears finally fell not loudly or theatrically, but with a quiet, devastating force that made the entire room feel smaller. She told the queen consort that the seat was not a decoration to be casually reassigned. It was a memory tied to William's mother, and some memories did not belong to protocol. William moved beside his wife then, and the air in the room changed instantly. The prince looked directly at Camilla and told her that some places in this family were simply not available for reassignment. He did not raise his voice, but the short sentence struck the room like an absolute verdict. King Charles stood there caught between marital loyalty and consequence, knowing that defending Camilla would deepen Catherine's pain and ignite William's permanent anger. The king wanted order above all else, but order had already failed. A courtier finally stepped forward and removed the disputed seating card from the table. The action was small, but its meaning was enormous. The chair remained empty. Camilla had not won it, Catherine had not surrendered it, and William had drawn the line his father could not draw. Behind every grand royal ceremony is a massive hidden machinery of code rules, signatures, ancient precedents, and quiet permissions from senior household staff. But on this unforgettable night, that machinery did not feel cold or distant to the family. It felt deeply personal and dangerous. A single historical protocol file, carried through a narrow side corridor by a visibly shaken palace, became the ultimate weapon that decided whether Camilla's aggressive claim would stand or completely collapse before the court. William waited near the grand doorway with the intense stillness of a man holding back more than just anger. The prince had already drawn a clear emotional line beside Catherine, but now the palace needed something harder than personal pain to resolve the crisis. It needed absolute written proof. A senior protocol officer moved quickly toward the private anteroom with his hands tense and his face completely pale knowing that opening the wrong historical page could deepen the royal disaster instead of settling it. The banquet file mattered immensely because palace ceremonies do not run on personal mood alone. They run on strict written orders, private royal instructions, and heavy precedents, meaning earlier official decisions that guide what can or cannot be changed by future generations. And somewhere deep inside that thick folder was a definitive answer everyone in the room feared. The officer returned to a room with the leather folder pressed close to his chest, as though the ancient papers inside carried physical heat. William opened the file without any ceremony or hesitation, turned the pages, slowly, not searching for personal drama, but for the one specific sentence that would protect what the room had nearly allowed to be stolen. Then his eyes found it. Diana's symbolic seat had not been preserved by mere custom or family accident. It had been legally protected under a private family instruction signed decades ago, a quiet direction meant to keep her memory completely untouched at certain ceremonial state banquets. That discovery changed everything instantly, because this was no longer a modern custom someone could casually revise for convenience. This was a strict legal boundary someone had knowingly crossed. William read the page once and again to be absolutely sure and closed the folder with control finality. The prince told the officer that the original instruction would remain in full force forever. There was no shouting, there was no theatrical performance, but his decision landed with the immense force of a royal command because it came from a son's grief sharpened into absolute institutional authority. Catherine, still visibly shaken, sat apart in a quiet corner, trying to steady her breathing, while Sophie quietly offered her a glass of water to help her recover. The trusted family confidant did not press the princess to speak. She simply stayed close, understanding that Catherine had not only been publicly embarrassed, she had been deeply wounded in the one place palace discipline could never protect. King Charles looked at the file and felt the heavy weight of the choice settle on his shoulders. The king understood that overruling the specific instruction would not look like support for his new wife. It would look like a direct attack on Diana's memory and Catherine's dignity. Camilla felt the balance of power shift away from her side of the room. The queen consort had entered the evening believing that her high position could win the room, but now authority had moved away from personal recognition and back toward inherited emotional precedent. The final decision became clear to everyone: Camilla would not sit there, and Diana's place would remain completely empty for the night. Yet keeping the chair empty did not calm the tense atmosphere within the palace. It only made everyone confront what had already been broken between them. The state banquet went ahead anyway, because the monarchy survives by continuing its public performance no matter the cost. Classical music played, glasses rose in toasts, and speeches were delivered with perfect timing for the guests. But beneath the polished ceremony, the royal family had fundamentally changed. Catherine's tears had exposed what protocol could no longer hide, and Camilla's failed claim had left a deep bruise that no polished smile could ever cover. Catherine returned to her formal place with controlled grace, but nothing about her calm demeanor felt easy or natural. The princess knew that every single guest at that long table had seen enough to understand that something sacred had been disturbed. Her eyes remained red, and even the most trained courtiers could not fully pretend not to notice her pain. She spoke politely when spoken to and smiled when duty demanded it, yet every polite exchange carried a massive hidden cost, because Catherine was carrying the pain of a family memory dragged into a battle over titles. William sat beside her with a guarded expression, and that guard became its own silent warning to the court. The prince answered foreign dignitaries with perfect manners, but his attention never fully left the other side of the table. Every movement from Camilla mattered now, and every glance from Charles mattered even more. William understood why the evening had to continue, because the monarchy depends entirely on showing absolute steadiness, even when the family inside the house is cracking. But he also understood something much darker. Continuing the dinner did not mean forgiving the insult. Continuing did not mean forgetting betrayal. And it certainly did not mean allowing Diana's memory to be tested ever again. Camilla took another seat further down the table, but victory had completely left her side. The queen consort remained physically composed, yet the space around her felt colder, as though confidence had quietly withdrawn from her. She had not been publicly punished by a decree, but the heavy silence itself had become a psychological punishment. King Charles rose to deliver his prepared remarks, and for a brief moment the monarch nearly regained control of the evening. Then his eyes accidentally moved toward the empty chair, and he stumbled slightly over one sentence, just enough for those closest to him to feel the truth. The seat had become far more powerful empty than it ever could have been occupied. Sophie noticed what others tried to ignore, seeing Catherine look once toward the chair not with anger, but with grief so quiet it almost broke the room again. A palace aide later whispered that the seating plan had been corrected, yet the words sounded less like an explanation and more like an admission that the palace had nearly allowed something unforgivable to happen. Senior staff began preparing a private report before the banquet had even ended, while William demanded that no Diana-related tradition be altered again without his direct approval. Camilla left the hall. Without her victory, Charles left with a heavy weight of institutional failure, and Catherine left knowing the deepest wound had not been healed. But the true turning point did not happen in the Grand Hall. It came later in a private room where Catherine and William finally spoke without any witnesses. After the banquet ended, the palace returned to silence, but silence did not mean peace. Catherine and William stepped away from the grand rooms, away from aides, away from ceremony, and into a private chamber where the monarchy's polished language no longer mattered. There their shared grief was allowed to breathe, and there the future king stopped pretending this was only about protocol. Catherine sat down first, and for the first time that night, she no longer had to hold herself together for the world. The princess had carried the way of the banquet with perfect discipline, but discipline had not protected her from the pain of seeing Diana's memory treated like something that could be shifted or reassigned. William stood near her in silence before finally sitting across from his wife. The prince had been controlled in public because he understood the cost of open anger, but here, without courtiers listening, he let the hurt show. William told Catherine that seeing her cry beside Diana's chair felt like watching the family fail his mother all over again. The words were not strategic. They came from the son inside the future king, the boy who had grown into duty while carrying a grief no title could erase. Catherine listened, and her own sadness deepened because she knew the chair had never been only about the past. It mattered because Diana remained an active part of William's heart, part of his children's story, and part of the emotional foundation Catherine had quietly protected for years. Catherine admitted that the moment hurt because it made Diana's place feel available, movable, and politically useful. She said some memories should not have to defend themselves every time power changes hands. William reached into his jacket and took out the folded seating card that had been removed from the table, setting it down between them. The prince said Diana's memory would never be bargained away again, and Catherine's tears slowed as something inside her shifted from sorrow into quiet resolve. The princess told William that protecting the past was not about refusing the future. It was about teaching their children that love, loyalty, and memory still mattered inside a monarchy surrounded by cold rules. That truth changed the room completely. William understood then that this was bigger than one banquet, one chair, or one confrontation with Camilla. It was about the kind of crown he would one day inherit, and the kind of family he refused to let disappear beneath ceremony. William made the decision before the night could swallow it, that Diana's reserved seat would be permanently protected at all future state banquets. Catherine stopped crying, the prince stood up, and both of them understood that secrecy had ended. By dawn, what happened inside the palace could no longer remain only a family wound, because the world had already begun to react to the news. The public did not need to see the entire confrontation to understand its heavy meaning, because one image or one whispered account from inside the palace was enough. By morning, the empty chair was no longer furniture. It had become a national symbol of memory, loyalty, and a question that has haunted the monarchy for decades. London woke to a headline that cut through every careful palace silence as a major newspaper placed the empty banquet chair across its front page with the words Diana's place left empty printed beneath it. And suddenly the private wound of one family belonged to the nation again, because Diana had never fully disappeared from public memory. She remained tied to grief, beauty, betrayal, and the emotional history of monarchy that had often looked powerful while struggling to appear human. Now Catherine's tears had turned that memory into the center of a new royal storm. A morning broadcaster gave the nation a phrase that made the scandal impossible to contain, calling it the night the palace discovered memories still outranks titles, and the word spread because they were simple, sharp, and painfully true. Camilla had entered the evening with the rank of queen consort, but the public heard the story differently, believing recognition had been pursued at the cost of respect for a woman still loved by millions. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace before the communications team had even finished drafting its response, placing white roses near the gates. Handwritten notes mentioned Diana, Catherine, and William in the same breath, as though the public had linked the past, present, and future of the crown into one emotional line. One elderly woman gave the sentence that captured the whole day, saying some seats belong to the heart, not the crown. Within hours, that phrase became more powerful than any official explanation. Catherine became the figure people protected, her tears seen as loyalty, as proof that someone inside the palace still understood the difference between ceremony and memory. William's silence gained its own meaning too, because the prince had acted like a son, refusing to let his mother's place become negotiable. Camilla faced the colder side of public judgment, viewed as emotionally careless at the worst possible moment. Charles felt the pressure tighten around the family, knowing the palace statement could only explain procedure, not repair feeling. In the end, the monarchy did what it so often does. After a storm, it chose a symbol and allowed that symbol to speak. No furious declaration was needed, no public punishment was announced, but the verdict was unmistakable. Diana's place remained untouched, Catherine's tears were honored, and Camilla learned that some royal boundaries cannot be crossed. Charles accepted the decision with the heaviness of a man who knew the palace had survived the night, but not without permanent damage. The king had spent years trying to hold together love, duty, and history, yet this moment proved those forces could still tear at one another. Revised protocol confirmed privately that Diana's reserved seat would remain protected at future ceremonial banquets. This was more than a rule, it was a promise that told everyone inside the institution that memory could not be rearranged simply because power had changed hands. Catherine received the support quietly, and William stood closest to her not as a prince performing loyalty, but as a husband who understood why her tears mattered. Senior aides understood what Catherine had done without planning to do it. She had given voice to a sorrow the family had buried for years, but never truly healed. Her emotion became the truth everyone else had been too careful to say aloud. William emerged from the crisis, changed, protecting Diana's legacy through a clear decision, one that declared some memories are not available for political convenience. He knew his mother's place could not depend on who held a title or who wanted recognition. That was why the empty chair mattered. It stood for a son, refusing to let history be cleaned away for comfort. Camilla faced the quiet cost of her failed claim, learning that recognition cannot be taken from another woman's absence, and that Diana's shadow was part of the monarchy's emotional foundation. The empty chair became the final image of the story, not as a rejection of the crown, but as a reminder of what keeps the crown human. Catherine's tears did not weaken the monarchy. They reminded it that loyalty, memory, and love are the only reasons the crown still matters. This was the night a state banquet became a reckoning, and the monarchy learned that even the most powerful titles must bow before the memories of a family that refuses to surrender.